I watched one of Chris Lake's 3-hour production live streams, so you don't have to, and learned a game-changing secret for why he's able to stay so firmly at the top as one of the leading innovators in tech house. So in this video, we're going to be making a funky tech house song inspired by Chris Lake's song, Ease My Mind. And we're going to find out if we can do this in under 6 hours by using the 80-20 rule of music production. What you're listening to is the finished song we'll be breaking down today. This tune only took me about 6 hours to finish, completely arranged, mixed, mastered, and ready to be used in DJ sets and sent out to record labels. After having produced music for over 15 years, this is easily the fastest and best way I've come across. You can download this video's project files, as well as over 30 full project files inspired by Beatport Top 100 songs, with new files being added weekly. Just visit the link on screen or in the description. And if finishing songs super fast like this is something you'd like help with, you can also download a free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that I use to completely finish one song per week. But for now, let's start with the first of the 4 quick and easy steps we'll be covering today. First, make sure your song is inspired by the quality of a professional example by choosing a reference track. But stop yourself from straight up copying your reference by having a new hook to focus on. Alright, so for each one of my projects, I like to make a project file page like this to act as a guide for you to see all the production tricks and processes in more detail and at your own pace. But for this one, we got the track, for the reference, we're doing Chris Lake and Abel, their song Ease My Mind. And the main reason that I chose this is I did see it kind of creeping up on the Beatport top charts. And when I listened to it, it had that like really cool, like kind of similar to that, like another vibe, like very disco-y, chilled, but like full modern sounding production, which is really cool. And then when I took a bit of a closer look into this, I actually saw that there was like a live stream that Chris Lake did where he was going over this tune as he was working on it. And so like it was a really good opportunity to kind of find a bunch of interesting techniques actually from the artists themselves, and that I would then actually be able to incorporate it into this video and the song that I ended up working on. In terms of the new hook, went for a remix. And this is Phil Collins and I think Philip Bailey's song Easy Lover. And why this song? It's amazing. It's a really, really sick song. And a kind of similar technique to what I mentioned in other videos is I've kind of tuned my like Instagram algorithm to like show me throwback tunes and all kind of stuff. So as I'm like scrolling, I'll find stuff like this and I will save it in my little saved area in Instagram. And that way I can, like, as I'm playing around with different reference ideas, I can jump into that little folder and have a look. So it's a really cool song, really huge chorus, and the verse in particular that I believe Philip Bailey does is really badass and a really good opportunity for interesting songwriting ideas. But now you might be wondering, how can you actually know that these two things are going to work well together, and how can you know that you won't spend hours producing just to find out that these ideas don't work and the whole idea is wasted? So here's how some very simple, basic music theory can really help at this point. So what I'll do is I'll look up a few important things. So for the reference track, the song is in G sharp minor, and the remix track is in C sharp major. And so this could present an issue because we're kind of combine an idea that's in the minor key and in the major key. But if we open up this bad boy here, C sharp would be D flat here, and the relative minor of this is B flat minor. So B flat minor is A sharp minor. And so that's going to kind of put us in the same key area, or like, yeah, the style of key. And so if it's G sharp and we're looking at A, now we can see by flipping from the major to its relative minor, we're now able to the difference is just two semitones, which is very easy. We can easily play with that when we're pitching around our ideas and trying to get them to work. And so we can actually build a minor bed of instrumentals underneath this Easy Lover song, and that's actually going to make it a little bit more unique sounding and pretty interesting. The next thing is the BPM. So the tempo of the reference track is 126, and the tempo of the remix track is 129. So super close, no problem there. The main thing you're looking for is if it's too large of a jump, you can kind of get that chipmunky sound, and really ruin the vibe of the original tune. And so that's how some basic music theory, we can kind of like be like, okay, this seems like a good idea. You can also kind of play them over each other, that kind of thing. But really the key takeaway here is to think through your vision, maybe 10, 15 minutes at least, at the beginning of the process. And this is going to give you some confidence knowing that you have an awesome, worthwhile idea and you'll be able to be motivated and focused from start to finish. But the thing is that none of this matters unless you actually start testing out your idea inside of your music making software. So what I'll do is I'll grab both of these two tunes here and I'll drag them into my default Ableton template. And then what I'll use is AI to separate the stems from both of them and kind of start pitching them around to make sure that they actually are compatible. And so on these pages here, you can find dedicated video tutorials on how to do all of that, in particular the Ableton template one and how I kind of prepare projects is in this one here. And then also on top of that, there's a link in the description to a YouTube playlist that has all of these videos as well. But a really cool thing is if you grab that free producer toolkit that I mentioned, you'll get access to all these pages for every one of my projects. You just won't be able to actually download the project files, but still really cool and useful stuff. But with that said, let's actually jump into Ableton now. All right. So this is a look at the project file after the first 30 minutes or so of producing. So I've added the reference and the hook into there. And have a listen to what's been accomplished so far and see if you can figure out how it's been finished and got to this point so quickly. So after preparing the template, what I'll do is start with the drums. And what I'll do is I'll extract out like an 8 or 16 bar loop of the reference track and then use AI to isolate and take out the drum part. If you then jump into this and remove everything under, say, around 200 hertz or so, you can essentially turn it into like a custom top loop. So have a listen to that. This kind of gets us going really, really quickly so we can move on to the more important stuff, actually building out like the melodic ideas. But because the low end is so important in dance music, we want to be able to control that. And the way that I like to do that is by slicing out a little kick here from either the reference, if you grab it from the intro, the outro, or from the AI section. And the thing is, when you slice a kick from a tune like that, it's usually a bit messy. There's at the very least like hi-hats and other drums in there. So to clean that up, there's a couple things you can do, but what I've been liking lately is this plugin here called Drum Clone. So it's like a beta plugin, but the idea is when you first drop the slice in, it sounds like this. So you can hear there's a lot of like hi-hat and like extra artifacts and stuff like that. And then after, the output sounds like this. So basically what Drum Clone here does is it analyzes the sample and then resynthesizes it so it sounds clean and full, and it's just using like sine waves and that kind of stuff. So what I also like to do lately is also drop that slice kick into this little rack that I have here. And basically what this does is it allows me to bring down the filter frequency, so remove the high end, while using a filter envelope, and it basically just kind of removes that like hi-hat and those extra sounds in a much more pleasing way, as opposed to making it sound like you're just kind of rolling off all the highs. So what that sounds like is like this. On top of that, it sounds quite weak. What I've also done is chucked an EQ8 on top of this and made it so that it's removing everything under 200 hertz as well. And the idea again is to kind of use this as like the high end of the kick, and then that way you can have like the full bodied synthesized kick and then also layer in some of that like high end mid kind of sound of the kick from the sample as well if you'd like to. In terms of any other processing here, then really there's actually nothing going on here. The main really 80-20 secret at this point is to dial in the volume. So the idea is to flick back and forth between your reference and what you're working on and adjust the volume so you kind of match a similar level of volume and power from your sounds compared to the references sound. So right now at this point, take a listen to the drums here and notice how that it captures the references grooves instantly while still giving us that complete control over the low end. But now the real reason we're producing super fast like this is, again, like I mentioned, we want to be able to test out our melodic ideas as quickly as possible, because that's really where things can kind of fall apart. If we spend too much time on the drums, it can sound really cool and we might have a good drum track, but then if we start working on the melodic stuff, it's not working with our new hook and we can't really figure out the right key and all that, we're gonna have to abandon the track. So the idea is to get to that melodic bit as quickly as possible. So what I like to do is move on to the bass next, and to quickly get the bass going, the AI stem separating tool that I use is called Nulo Stems, and one of the reasons that I like it is it'll separate out the drums, bass, and vocals and synths all in one shot. So then what that does is I can grab the AI bass stem that I have here, and you can drag that into a MIDI clip like this, and it'll do the convert audio to MIDI function. So if you click melody for this instance, this is kind of what it looks like. You can see it kind of like gets us in the ballpark. It's not ever perfect at this point in time, but it does get you in the ballpark. So the idea here is then what you can do is flick back and forth between the reference and what you have going on. You can also flick back and forth between the reference and or what you're working on and the AI stem as well, and fine tune the MIDI notes so that you can get it sounding a bit closer. So the nice thing about this is it allows you to quickly capture that groove of the original bass, and also gives you the flexibility to be able to turn it into something unique. So at this point though, what I would then also do is introduce our new hook after AI separating it. So you can see, then listen to that hook here. So freaking cool. And then the idea is to incorporate that in with, as you're building your loop here, and adjust your MIDI notes of your bass so that it is supporting and reinforcing and in service of that new hook. And so have a listen at this point to the bass that we've added in with the hook and with the drums, and listen how it kind of pushes the track from being a carbon copy of the reference and into something a bit more unique and original and usable. But now let's talk a bit of sound design. So when I'm starting, what I like to do is I like to start off with a sub bass, and this is really good because it carries the low end energy, and it also makes it a lot easier for us to dial in the right notes since you're not distracted by like crazy wild sound design. So what I have here is this rack. It's called the V sub, and it's just using an Ableton operator to do a sine wave. And the idea is that we can then just quickly add in a bit of saturation to add some grit, help it cut through small speakers, and it also a little bit of saturation on the sub here is going to create some harmonic content in like the low mids area, which will then help as a kind of a bridge between our sub and our mid bass layer that we're going to get into a moment. There's also like a one knob sidechain. It's almost like the LFO tool, just one knob sidechain. We don't have to fuss with compressors or anything annoying like that. But really, like, and then if you want to actually hear what the sub bass sounds like on its own. So it's really like the majority of the sound is coming from that. But then we want to introduce the mid bass layer, which is where we're going to be able to introduce even more texture and character to our bass sound. And we can go nuts with what's going on this mid bass layer without it compromising the quality of our low end. And this next one is a kind of a cool, crazy technique that's going to make your workflow a lot more efficient. So what I like to do is on the mid bass layer, I'm actually routing in the MIDI from the sub layer into this track, so we don't have to copy and paste over the MIDI clips into this layer. And then what we can use is a pitch device. So in this instance, I've moved it up an octave because the mid bass layer, the notes that it was playing, didn't sound good at the same octave as the sub. And then the main trick here is you're going to want to remove all the low end, like around 200 hertz or so. So that way the sub is taking care of that area. And then we're just kind of working on the mid bass kind of layer there, focusing more on like the sound design and the texture and the character. So if you want to check out a video for that, there's definitely a really good one in the playlist that you'll want to see. But then in terms of any processing here, removing some of the highs, a little bit of erosion. This is kind of a cool technique because what you can do is like play with the erosion, automate this to kind of open up and change the sound over time. A little bit of echo, adding a bit of space, and a little bit of this standard channel strip that I have here. So we're just dialing in a bit of one knob sidechain, a little bit of width. This is the free Polyverse Wider plugin. And I've just mapped the core main knob to a rack here. That way you can dial in with one button. And that's really kind of the idea here. And really though, the big lesson at this point, because again, including all the research that we've done and like this bit of production, This is only about 45 minutes to an hour of producing. And what we want to do is test out our song's vision with as little time and effort as possible at the beginning, so we can make sure that we aren't wasting our time later on developing an idea that would never work. And this approach is like a very clever way to capture your references groove instantly, while also giving you all these opportunities to adjust the important things like the kick and the bass and all that. And it basically quickly creates a canvas for you to properly test out your vision even more as quickly as possible, because the next step is going to be to actually start building out more of the layers, starting with the melodic layers because that's so important to the tune, and then we're going to go back and actually recreate the drums and make our own original drums. But now let's fast forward about another hour or two of producing and take a listen to the final loop that I ended up coming up with. Gonna pause the vocals. So when it comes to finishing your loop, so at this point we're kind of moving on to a lot of the more melodic stuff, so like kind of chords and synths and all that. And this is really where you should be kind of going wild and letting your unique sound come out and letting your style kind of shine through. It is good to like flick back and forth between the reference and kind of find some similar elements. Like, okay, if there's a pad, you want to have your version of a pad. If there's a lead, you want to have your version of a lead. Like kind of pick out similarities, similar layers that you want to develop. But you also really want to kind of take into a unique direction and let your own sound come through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, start with what I worked on next, which is the melodic stuff. And then we're going to move on to the drums that I recreated, because now what you're listening to there was no longer AI drums. And I'm going to kind of show more of the mindset as well as a bunch of tips and tricks about how you can kind of produce really like in service of the hook, supporting the main hook layers, so that you can create a really fulfilling song. And also in particular, there's a mix as you go technique that I want to go over. So a little bit of babbling there, but let's jump into the melodic layer. So I'm going to just kind of play this and kind of show you what it looks like on its own first. So you can hear it's very atmospheric, and there's like kind of a guitar line, because definitely from the Chris Lake live stream I saw that he said that the Abel Balder guy sent over vocals and a bunch of guitar riffs. So I kind of wanted to kind of emulate that kind of vibe of almost getting handed a bunch of those elements, and so you can kind of build something similar to the Ease My Mind tune. So let's kind of go over like some of the key layers here. One of the first things I added was this organ sound. And so the main thing here is I'm actually just repurposing the MIDI bass line, as you can see by the title here, and just pitched it up a bunch. Reusing parts like this can be really important to kind of create a cohesion to your sound, and also makes it a lot easier. I think a problem that some newer producers come into is they feel like everything needs to be crazy, shredding, and taking, showing off how great they are or technical they can be. But really, like a lot of this simple stuff really works the best and can be super fast too. And it's more in service of the whole tune. So just repurpose the MIDI there. In terms of the sound, I'm using a basic organ bass. So it's kind of that like housey M1 organ sound, but just pitched up so it's more of like a mid bass, mid synth, or like lead kind of sound. A little bit of this corrosion, so it's adding a little bit of like crispy interestingness to the sound. Just trying to make it sound a little bit more interesting. Rolling off a bit of lows here because we don't want it to interfere with our low end. A little bit of echo, so it's a little bit more spacey. And then we're running into the standard channel strip. So I'm going to go over this a little bit more this first time and then move faster later on. Because when it comes to the 80-20 mixing, a lot of it's mixing as you go. So one of the first things I'll do is make sure that there's some side chain so it's pumping. And this is just a one knob side chain, so we don't have to fuss around with compressors or anything like this. And then there's a couple of areas where I'll look at next. One is width. So I have this free Polyverse wider plugin just mapped the core knob to a rack, so it's a lot faster. And this is, for in this instance, pushing the sound to the left and right a bit, making it a bit wider, and keeping the space in the middle free for our main element, which is the vocal. Then another thing is kind of the ADSR, or the envelope, or like the attack and sustain, the tail of the sound. So what I have is the free kilohertz transient shaper. And with the attack, you can control that initial hit a bit more. So sometimes you want to make it more subtle, or sometimes you want to make it more pronounced. But a lot of times what I'm finding is for a lot of sounds, I'm dialing back the sustain to make it a tighter sound. I feel like controlling the sounds so they're not as loose is a really good technique to make things sound a lot more professional. Then you might want to counteract that because it's going to remove some of the volume. You can bring that back with some saturation or some gain. So saturation can add a little bit of grit and texture to the sound and can also help add a bit of extra harmonic content so it kind of pushes out a little bit more. So sometimes it's a little technique that I like to do. I don't know if this is good or not, to be honest, but it's what I like to do. I like to like bring back some volume that I've taken away with maybe sidechain or some of these other processing techniques, and then bring it back with a little bit of saturation. But then usually when you're using saturation, you might want to like bring the gain down to compensate, but something that I like to do here. So the idea is to have like that general process that I'm following each time, removing lows, playing with the transients, width, and sidechain. But again, like I mentioned earlier, the main thing is flicking back and forth to your reference and kind of dialing your ear on the element that you're trying to replicate and getting the volumes correct. The volumes is really kind of the biggest thing. Also on the sends and returns, I'm always usually dialing in some amount of reverb, delay, like a short delay and a longer delay. Let me know if you want me to make a video about how to set that up and use that properly. But this is basically just trying to make it a little bit spacier, and we're using the same reverbs and delays to kind of keep everything in the same space. Next up is there was a respace that I added. It's more of a transition structure technique, so we'll get to that a little bit later. The next main thing here is there's this guitar loop that I've muted, but it is being used as a carrier for a vocoder, I believe. Yeah, so this is what the guitar loop sounds on its own. Cool, kind of like funky, plucky, kind of another sounding, I would almost say, guitar part. And it's turned off because what I'm doing is I have this other drum loop here. Without the vocoder, this drum loop sounds like this. Oh, there's a tantra on it. Cool disco-y loop. And then with the vocoder and the tantra, it sounds like this. Those weird atmosphere sounds, and basically the vocoder is bringing in the audio from that guitar loop, and it's using the rhythm and like the hits of the drum loop to let the guitar through on those bits, and a little bit of tantra to make a weird spacey underwater sound, and then standard channel start moving some lows, a little bit of sidechain. This is more of a weird atmospheric thing, very subtle, kind of cool minimal house techniques that I've been learning in the last little bit. Next up is this kind of piano chord. And this was really trying to emulate what Chris Lake was doing in the live stream, was actually like playing in some Rhodes, I believe. And I don't really like playing in parts, so I just like looked up chords on Splice, and then cut it up and reorganized the slices to make a chord progression, and then used like a lot of delay on the send return to kind of fill in the gaps between these cuts, or else it would sound very abrupt. In terms of any processing, standard channel stuff, removing some lows, a little side chaining. There's a little bit of a call and response little element here, so let me put these two together. This happens at the end of every, whatever, three bars. Little like jazzy piano kind of echoey tinkliness, cool little fill. So it's very atmospheric stuff. We're doing kind of like a lot of call and response, very subtle stuff, slowly building up the layers over time to create a full soundscape. Next kind of really interesting thing is this guitar loop. So main thing here is it's just a cool like electric guitar loop that I found on Splice. Again, this is why that like intro is so important, where we're kind of really figuring out what the key of the song is, because then when you're looking up Splice, you can there's a lot more options for you to explore, and you can find sounds that are going to fit your production a lot quicker and easier. In terms of any processing here, throwing on this tantra, which is just like a cool weird effect plugin, and then usually with this I'll just dial in the mix, so it's adding a bit of that kind of like dubby, echoey, filtery coolness that I really like as a sonic character in my songs. Again, that's maybe more of a me thing, but you want to kind of find your own lane with that kind of stuff. So I have kind of my go-to moves. Some of them are more creative and some of them are more mixing based. Moving on to the more mixing based stuff, we're always removing a bit of lows to keep things not muddy. And then again, this one I'm dialing back the attack because I don't want those transients to hit so hard. I want it to fit more in the background so that it's not overtaking the vocal. We're always trying to add layers that are in service of that main vocal. That's the production philosophy that I have for sure. Then we're also doing some side chains, so pumping, making room for the kick, and then a little bit of width, so we're pushing to the left and right, making it a bit more stereo, and then dialing back the sustain to make that sound a little bit tighter, so it's not sustaining as much and taking up space in the song. It's getting pulled back a little bit quicker, letting elements come through is really like, I think, a nice way to explain that. What else do we have? Some strings that I added in. This kind of comes in more just in the back half, so this is a bit more of a structure thing that I'm going to get to in a moment, but the idea here is like this is something that's not in the beginning drops. It comes in the breakdown and then like is a subtle extra layer in the final drop, so that there's a bit more of a climax on that last drop. A little bit of more of a structure thing, but can't resist giving you a little teaser there. Next element is this, which is I don't even remember what it was. So I think it was some kind of like acid synth loop, and basically I've added a bunch of effects on this to kind of make it sound a little bit more like almost like a funky what was his name, Nigel, the guy that was doing it on the Daft Punk stuff. He's like a legendary guitarist, and just that very like percussive sounding like guitar, like raking the strings kind of thing. And so for that, I was using this A1 trigger gate, which I absolutely love. It's free. Definitely grab this. It adds like that stutter house effect, but there's also a bunch of like presets where it'll add like more of a trancey sounding stutter with an echo that makes it really dubby and atmospheric, which I absolutely love. And then a little bit of tantra, so it's making it even more spacier and weirder. And then standard channel strip stuff, removing some of the lows. This one I wanted the attack a bit more pronounced. So I dialed the attack up a little bit. The sustain is down a little bit, and it's also automated. So at certain points, it's going to sound tighter, and certain points, it's going to sound a little bit more open. A little bit of sidechain, playing with the gain. Can't remember what this washed out thing is. To be honest, I think it like throws a reverb on, like, it's more of a transition trick. Let's keep moving along. A couple other elements here. This is another version of that same acid line. So I've repurposed that and just kind of played with it in a different way. And this one, I think it's more of this one was like more of a transition trick. So it comes in at different points. This I've been loving a lot lately. Have a listen to this. So what this is I basically will catch a section of the vocal where I want it to do like a cool repeat. And I have this new little plugin, like a preset that I made called Vocal Throw. And basically it's at quarter notes and it's all the way 100% wet, because what I want is, like, I don't want it to play the original vocal over top of the actual vocal track and then have it echo. I just want to capture the echo. So it's a cool little trick. I think if we go to the arrangement, you can see it in action here. So on this Vox throw here, we have it come in here. So this is overlapped with the actual vocal line, but it's just the delay of it. So it's just going to echo out. And so I've thrown that in like here, where this is actually catching the vocal and sending it out. But then what I also did is I switched this track to resampling, just soloed this one out and just recorded just that echo. This way I have control over it and I can like throw it in throughout the track. And it's a nice way to reuse the main element, and it's like a subtle way to kind of fill out the sound a little bit more, make it more atmospheric and interesting. And it's almost like in between a pad and like a synth line almost. And I just think it's really cool. I've been really loving experimenting with that. And then like tossing in like creative weird effects like crystallizer and stuff like that. Moving a bunch of the lows, sidechain, that kind of thing. And then we got the standard house string. That this is again a bit more of an arrangement trick. As you can see, like in the arrangement, it like slowly comes in and then it shows up more on like the back half. So it's on the final drops where an extra string is coming in to just fill out the sound a little bit more and make it a little bit more interesting. And this is like a classic house technique. It's just a single note that it's playing in key. And I just created a little rack here where it's a house string sample, and I've set it up so that it plays the initial hit and then does an infinite loop, so you can have this house string sustain forever and ever and ever. So let's look at all the melodic stuff. Let's have a look at now the drums. So for the drums, what we did is at the beginning, we isolated out the kick and then created a drum loop out of like the AI stem. And then the idea is to then recreate everything else from that drum loop. And so we have our own hits, and there's a specific way in order to follow that I feel makes the most sense. So first, we're going to get rid of that AI drum loop. And then the idea is to flick back and forth between your reference and what you're working on, and pay attention to the drums. Focus on the drums, and first listen to the element that's sticking out the most for you. For me, it's usually either like the snare, the clap, or the open hi-hat after the kick. The kick is important, but we've already dialed in the kick at the beginning. So you kind of want to go through this process of like picking the most important element, adding it into your production, and then moving on to the next most important element. In terms of dialing things in a little bit even more, I feel like the best process is, so for me, it was the snare. First focus on the pattern, then focus on the sound selection. And then the third thing, just like a very recurring thing here, is dial in that volume. That's going to be the kind of 80-20 fastest route to making things sound badass. And then there's that extra consideration of things like working the channel strip. So paying attention to maybe side chaining, width, and the attack or sustain. So let's kind of work through the drums now. I'm going to have the kick playing, and we're going to have, let's start with the snare. So this is what the first element that I heard. So let's take a look and listen to this. Focus in on the snare. So in terms of the pattern, it's your classic, like on the 2 and 4. So this is very common. So I've set up my template. So like there's already this MIDI track in here, and then it's just a matter of kind of moving things around to choose different sounds. We don't have to punch things in every time is kind of the idea. And then, so it looks a little bit more confusing than it is, but for snares and for claps, usually what I like to do is like start with one like this, and then have additional layers. And that way different hits are hitting at different times, and so there's a little bit of like humanization kind of factor that's kind of happening. It makes the beat sound a lot less robotic or mechanical. In terms of the sound design, what I did is I think I extracted a bit of the snare and then used the show similar file function to find a couple of different sounds. And then because I was kind of getting like an 80s vibe, kind of from the Easier Mind track, and also just kind of like a little bit of, it was definitely influenced by adding in that Phil Collins tune. I wanted to add in what's called a gated reverb, which is like a classic snare sound, like a reverb that would be added to snares in the 80s, just to kind of like, you know, have a homage to that kind of sound. So it sounds like fuller, and like a weird reverb has been kind of added to it, but it's been gated, I guess, so it doesn't ring out too much. I don't know, something like that. But that was the idea. So I just found some samples like that, layered that in, so it's a little bit thicker sounding and has that cool 80s sound. And then in terms of any processing, we're just removing some lows. So let's kind of look at that. Main thing there really was flicking back and forth between the reference and what we're working on to really dial in that volume. And then the next thing, I usually like to reinforce snares with claps or vice versa. If I do a clap first, I'll usually want to reinforce it with a snare. The idea is I like to have the snares down the middle and the claps a little bit more to the left and right, wider. So let's have a look and listen to the claps. Let's solo the claps. So this one, again, as you can hear, it's kind of like different samples are hitting, and then the last one is a little bit higher sounding, so it's like ka, 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 ka kind of thing, like trying to like create almost little micro hooks within the drums even. And the idea here is to have 2 claps playing, one's a bit to the left and one's a bit to the right, and each time there's a different like variation playing, so that it sounds again more human and interesting. In terms of the processing, or in terms of the sound selection now, the main thing I have here is I've found like maybe the 5 or 6 of my favorite claps and put them all in a drum rack. I've done the same for snares and open hats and closed hats, and this is something I'd recommend you do as well. So this way, instead of every time you're always looking for, you know, tons of different, going through like 100 or 200 claps or whatever, which can take forever. The idea is like spend some time to like create your own little drum racks with some of your favorite claps, so that way you can just jump in, use those, and then if you need to find other stuff, you can, or you can use like the show similar files functionality or anything like that to sample and find interesting other sounds within your library, but having your own core is really cool because it's going to speed up your production workflow, and then also it's going to help add to your signature sound. It's a subtle thing, but like when even like, you know, similar snares and claps or closed hats or anything are kind of consistent from release to release and song to song, that's kind of how you slowly build up your own sonic character and your own unique sound. Having these things reused and similar sounds from production to production. So in terms of any processing, standard channel shift stuff, in this instance, we're just pushing the width up a little bit and then removing some of the lows. Next element that I heard is the open hat that I really wanted to dial in. So let's have a look and listen to that. And then right at the end here, the pata is something I was definitely hearing in the Ease My Mind tune. But for the pattern, it's really just that offbeat classic open hat. So again, I have my template set up, so this is already there. And then it was just a matter of like starting with one and then pressing Option and then dragging up to the next sound that I wanted to layer in. In terms of the sound, this I'm just using like some of my favorite pre-set up open hat sounds, and just kind of flicked between them to dial in the ones that I thought that were the closest in sonic character to what was in the Ease My Mind tune by flicking back and forth. And in terms of processing here, we're just dialing back a little of the sustain, so it's a bit of a tighter hat, removing some of the lows. That's really it with the open hat. Then, similar to the snares and claps, I'll usually like to then layer underneath a closed hat. So let's have a look and listen to the closed hat. Let's solo that. So it's kind of a combination of like a little skippiness and then also just having like a solid hat playing, because really this is like very disco-y, so it's almost like it's just like imagine like an actual drummer playing like cat, you know what I mean? Like is like that's kind of like the vibe of these disco housey kind of vibey tunes. So I have like one hat kind of just playing that solid little groove there, and then I added in these little skippies, which is something that I think I was kind of hearing in the reference tune there. In terms of the sound selection, again, I just relied on some of my favorite go-to closed hat sounds here, and then processing, just removing some lows, nothing much. Main thing was dialing in the volume. So at this point, this is what I would call kind of having your core loop. So we have like our kick, snare, clap, open hat, and closed hats, and these are all like with one shots, high quality one shots that we've programmed in ourselves, and it's kind of like the core beat. So all in all, it sounds like this at this point, which is solid and it's a good foundation, but it's boring. So what I like to do at this point is now we're like layering in drum loops. So top loops, breaks, those kind of things. We're gonna layer these in to underneath our core loop to give it more vibe and texture and interesting vibe. In particular, if like you've been really close to the reference track at this point as you've been building out your core loop, this is a beautiful way to start pushing it into a new direction by incorporating some loops. And the idea is like, even in this instance, you might see there's quite a few different loops. Each one is very subtly mixed in, and I'm gonna show you that process and the philosophy of how to do that. And right now, let's just jump into it. So the first one that I added in was this one here, and let's solo this new element. So the main thing you could hear there is what I was trying to add in was that disco bit, like disco vibe. You know what I mean? It's just like a solid beat, and there's a lot of like just like it sounds like a very humanized hi-hat pattern that's been played in, and there's also these extra like and like open hat sounds that sound really cool and disco-y, right? So that was the idea there. And oh man, also huge tip here, I've removed the AI stem of the drums from this, but that's a great way. What you could do is like right click on that like AI stem and press show similar files, and it'll show you a bunch of top loops and full drum loops that sound similar to that AI stemmed drum loop. And that's how I found a bunch of these. So the super cool way to find something similar within your library that you can layer in. In terms of the processing, a couple things I do want to point out here is generally with the top loop, something I like to do is jump into the clip, make sure it's on beats and on transients, and set this to the arrow pointing to the right, and then you can dial back this element here. So I have it at 80. And this is going to tighten up the transient. So it's going to make the top loop sound tighter. And again, the idea here is to have tighter top loops because it's going to blend in more with your core loop because it's not a loose and ringing out and like distracting. It's like tighter and like nestling underneath your core loops. So that's kind of like the philosophy behind that. In terms of any processing, we're moving some lows, a little bit of sidechain for pumping, and again, like making room for our actual main kick and bass. Main thing though is dialing in the volume. For this, you're kind of dialing in a little bit more to taste. A good trick to do in any time when you're dialing in volume is like start lower, bring it up until you can kind of hear it, and then dial it back a little bit. The next element that I added in was this drum loop here. Let's solo that. So this is a cool, like very chill, human disco-y drum loop kind of thing. I've cut it up a bunch, you can see here, because basically it was just doing too many like fills and too much weird shit, and it was distracting. I just wanted to grab a little bit of the vibe and then have it like play a little bit more at certain points to act as like a mini fill. In terms of the processing, again, we're tightening this up a shit ton here with the little transient trick, and then processing, removing a bunch of the lows, removing some of the attack, dialing the sustain way back, a bit more sidechain, and pushing it to the left and right with a bit of width. Adding some width without polyverse wider on the top loops is such a nice way to like have it blend in more. Yeah, it's really good. You definitely experiment with that. And yeah, when you grab the project files, you can grab this like mini strip and all this kind of cool stuff too. Let's move on. Next element I added in was this. Let's solo it. So you can hear there, main thing trying to incorporate is a little bit more of a skippy, shakery sounding hats to add a little bit more movement and like interest to our actual core loop there. What we're doing is again tightening up with the transient trick on the clip, and then we're removing a ton of the lows, dialing back the attack because we don't want it to be too abrasive. We're trying to nestle it into our core loop, right? A little bit of sidechain, a little bit of width. Let's move on to the next one. Let's have a listen to this. I'm gonna solo it. So this one, it's kind of like, again, more of a adding kind of that higher end shakery, but there's a little bit of like a bongo-y kind of filliness that's being added in as well. That's really cool with this loop. We are again tightening it up with the clip transient trick, and then what we're doing is removing a ton of the lows, side chain, removing this, pushing the sustain back a bit, and again adding in a bunch of width. And then I believe the last one that we're going to go over next is this loop here. And let's solo that. This one's cool. So this is just like clearly we're adding in some extra hats and trying to going again, like I mentioned, for that disc week, like kind of like it's just like very rock solid kind of like hi-hat drumming. And the main thing here is that I cut it up a bunch because it was very Philly. If I play it by itself, I think it was like this. It was just every like bar it was ending in that open hat, and I didn't necessarily want it to do that all the time. So basically, I just cut it up a bit, and then some of these I brought the transients in a bit more, so it wasn't as a big sustaining open hat. And then sometimes it is even tighter, and it kind of just changes a little bit. So it's again adding to that humanization feel. This one is a bit more open. So then like the end of every whatever that is, there's a much larger open hat little fill coming in. So just trying to control that and make it sound a little bit less loopy is kind of like the main thing. And then now at this point, this is what all the drums sounded like. All right, but now here's the thing. Most producers think that turning their loop that we've just created into a finished song is the hardest part, but it can actually be the complete opposite when we follow the right process. So what I want to kind of show you is like how I structured this really quickly, and we'll actually go through the song structure and kind of show you a little bit of some of the interesting things going on there. So main thing is like what you want to kind of do is like treat all your loops here, everything, all these elements as puzzle pieces. So we have our kick, we have our bass, we have all the drums, and we have the melodic stuff, and then we also have the vocals. And then what I'd like to do is like build your loop to the climax. So like what we have here is like the fullest, biggest, most awesome part of the tune. So you might even want to overproduce your loop so that you have even more elements to work with. And then what you want to do is we're going to use that arrangement track that we've created, and you can grab this and then like drop it into the point of the tune where it's going to kind of be that climax. So maybe it's in like the second or third or drop, right? Put that full loop there, and then that way you know that you're creating your structure to get to this point. And this is going to make sure you don't like overproduce in certain areas, because the beginning of the song should be slowly building up energy. That's something you want to kind of think about. Like you're slowly building up the energy, bringing it down with a break to kind of create tension, then bring it in for the drop. But on a big macro level, you're constantly slowly trying to bring it up to get to that main drop. And it's a lot easier way to work this way, instead of like as you're building out from left to right, you might be like, oh, I need to add all these layers now because I've already blew my load on the first drop. This is going to be a really smarter way to work. And then the idea here is then what you can do is then listen through like your reference and follow these arrangement track as a guide. And you can almost even do it like blind at first. So what you can do is like grab the intro. Maybe in the first half there's no kick, but in the first half of it, it's just a drum intro. So you can just grab this whole little puzzle piece, drop that in there. In this instance, I have a break here, so we'll add in a little bit of this, some drums, but take out the kick, and we're going to put the bass line in there. So like you can just do it like this, and then you can flick back and forth here. Now the sub is coming in, so at this point we might just grab the kick and the bass and all that and just kind of throw that in here. And you can actually kind of do it blind, but the idea is to use it as like a puzzle piece and move it from left to right using the layers that you already have. And a really good trick is to actually like listen from section to section. Every 8 or 16 bars or so, there's going to be small changes. So you want to listen to that, and you can listen to the layers that's in your reference track to build out what layer should be present in your tune. That's like a good like first step. So let's kind of do like a little drive-by of what that would look like in our tune here. The first run that I'll usually do is kind of like follow it a lot closer to the reference, and then do another pass where kind of adjusting it more to your new hook and trying to make that sound a lot more original and interesting. I'm going to keep the vocals off because copyright stuff basically, but let's have like a quick run through here. So it starts off with like a drum intro, just drums, and then 8 bars hits. So we're going to introduce the kick full, and then this is something that I did that isn't in the ease my mind bit. I added a break right away, started introducing some of the melodic stuff here. And then I added this cool little pause that I think is cool as hell. So sick. But yeah, so then it's this kind of sub bit here. There's like slowly more elements. Like you can see, I just pressed 0 on the keyboard to remove some of the clips. So it's like slowly more layers are being added in. On the second half here, there's a bit more going on. Little production here. Trick is to remove the kick. Let me go into break. The vocal comes in here. And then on the main track, actually let me show you this. So something that I do have is this like little master effect. So you can quickly like add like reverb and remove the low end. And this is like a nice way to almost act like a DJ for your own track and like make nice little adjustments. So you're creating tension by removing the bass. That way, when it comes back in, sounds sick as fuck. So right at this point, the vocals are in. It happens for, I think, 16 bars. And then I made it kind of drop out and go into a verse. This is how sick this sounds. So fucking sick. So for the verse here, what I did is just removed a bunch of the melodic layer, so it's a bit more of like just drums and bass with a little bit of melodic stuff going on. And then in the second half of it, adding in a bit more, the guitar comes in. So you can see like just it's a very interesting like layering technique. We're kind of pulling things away more than we're adding things in. Then it goes into the drop again. Vocals are in, and then it builds down. Vocals are gone. There's kind of this little new riff that I added in. And then we got the breakdown. Removing a bunch of the lows, setting it up so that there's like this one knob kind of effect, adding in reverb and like a riser, that kind of thing. It's like slowly the drums are being filtered out as well. Then it removes them completely almost. Just kind of create more and more tension. And then final drop. Double it up, add the house string on the second half. And like some of that like acidy synth kind of thing. That's more transy really. And then it builds down. And then drums. First half with the kick, second half with the kick kind of like removed. And that's kind of the idea there. Definitely what you'd want to do is like grab the project files. There's a lot of automation. So something that I'll usually do is like automate, like instead of just having an element just appear, you can have it slowly filter in. A lot of little automation tricks and layering tricks that it would take forever to kind of go over that in just here, but it's a really good trick. And then another thing is adding in kind of these effects. So these are like your standard cheesy, I would say, like crashes and like laser sounds. And like sweeps and noises and that kind of stuff. The main trick here is these are so important. I think the main thing is just they need to be mixed in very subtly so that they're supporting like your actual song and not like here comes like a huge like crappy sound. Subtlety is going to make this sound so cool and like add like a little bit of extra professionalism to your sounds and help transition into each part. So you can see it's everything. There's usually something happening every 4 or 8 bars in this kind of department. And then another big trick here is I believe I'm using Dom Dolla's Saving Up from one of my previous project file breakdowns. So if you save my projects or any of your projects, I've been showing this trick lately. You can actually just jump into like the project files and you'll see the individual groups and you can just drag the effects group in there or the drum group or whatever you want to do, but in this instance effects. And that way you already have kind of like a pre-made effects group and you can kind of just move things around to better fit your arrangement. And then after that, last thing, how do you actually know that the song is done or not? That's a really big question that you might have. And the main thing that I like to do is something called pick 3. The idea is like once you're kind of at this point, you're going to pick the 3 things that are the most important to the song and to the listener's perspective. So that would be like, for example, like, okay, if the vocal is gone after the drop and it's sounding hollow and something needs to be there, maybe a synth or something, that's something that the listener will notice and you should work on that part. A little bit of EQ on the kick drum or compression on the kick drum, no one's going to fucking notice that. So like you shouldn't waste your time on that kind of stuff, I would say. So think about the 3 things that are going to have the biggest impact on the listener. Finish those 3 things and then commit to finishing. Then the last thing is a little bit of like mixing and mastering. I do need to make a video on this. I promise to do it. But the main thing is I'll do a little bit of group processing. So that's mainly, I'm even using this AI compressor that's really cool. That way it can like listen to the source and then adjust the compressor for me. I've been doing it more of like on the punchy preset and using parallel processing so it's not fully compressing the group, and then a little bit of clipping so we're just dropping off some of the tops of the transients. Main thing here is reducing the dynamic range a bunch so that we're going to have more to work with when we are doing the mastering. Another thing that I am doing is I like using this track spacer and it's side chained to the vocal. So this way, when the vocal comes in, it's going to bring down the melodic elements only in the vocal frequencies, only when the vocals are playing. So it kind of ducks it out a little bit in a nice, subtle, intelligent way to make room for the vocals. And then in terms of the final mastering, it's just my standard mastering channel strip. So it's a compressor, clipper, something called Golfos, and then like a limiter and a clipper and a limiter. And it's just the idea of like shaving off about like a decibel or so of gain reduction for each one of these things. So each device isn't working like overdrive, and it's all kind of cascading, working together nice and slowly. And yeah, I'm gonna do a video on that at some point. But yeah, so that was a pretty good rundown of all of this. What we'll do next is jump into a recap of the 80-20 rule, so you can actually apply some of this stuff into your own tunes as quickly as possible.
Hi, my friend, Matt from Best Friends Club here. And if you've been paying attention to this super long video, then you've probably figured out what the 80-20 rule is when it comes to building out your songs. The goal here is to get 80% of the result with only 20% of the time, energy, and effort. And because the first key to the 80-20 rule here is to use a reference track, we're making sure that we're very easily hitting 80% of a high quality, professionally made song. In particular, we use that reference track to make sure that we're picking the right notes, sounds, and volumes as we're building out our song. The second key of the 80-20 rule here is to mix as you go in an extremely streamlined way by only focusing on the volume of each track, as well as using a simple repeatable channel strip for each track that we're adding to our songs. The third and final key is to repurpose your old project files and have a suite of powerful templates, Ableton racks, and one-knob effects that you've personalized and curated over time. If you'd like to get a head start by downloading all the racks, templates, and all the files that you've seen me use in the Ableton project file for this video, or if you'd just like to take a closer look at any of the techniques or tracks you saw me work on in this video at your own pace, you can find a link to this video's project files on screen now and at the second link that's in the YouTube description. I'm recreating a different song from the Beatport top charts every single week and making the project files available to anyone who wants them. You'll also get access to a private Discord where you can ask me and the community questions, as well as share tracks for feedback. If you or your music are not quite ready for a shot in the arm like that, I've also made you a completely free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that have helped me figure out how to completely finish one new song each and every single week. And you can grab that free Ultimate Song Finishing Toolkit by visiting the first link that's in the YouTube description here. However, if you just feel like staying on YouTube for now, that's totally fine. Save that link for later, and check out this playlist filled with videos just like the one you just watched, where I completely create songs inspired by tracks found in the Beatport top charts. Or if you really want to take what you've learned in this video to the next level, make sure you check out this video right here.